Dad slid the manila envelope across the kitchen table like it was a clean, clinical thing. You have 72 hours to vacate, he said, voice flat and practiced. Emma looked up with that tight smile she reserves for Instagram moments like she'd rehearsed the angle. For a second my brain went blank and then my mouth did something before I thought. I smiled and replied, okay. The fridge hummed, a single drop of cleaner traced the cabinet, and Mom murmured, it'll be good for you to spread your wings. I set the wrench on the table carefully like it could shatter the moment. Silence stretched and I watched everyone waiting for a reaction they could control. I felt like a radio you could tune but nobody had. 72 hours, I said aloud slow. That's not how the lease works. Dad's jaw tightened. We've handled this, he said. We need flexibility to move forward. Emma chimed like she was reading from a script. We'll help you with moving costs, Jace. You'll be fine. The way she said help felt like a math problem where the numbers never add up in my favor. I flipped the envelope open and counted the pages. The deed transfer, the LLC paperwork, a typed eviction notice with a lawyer's letterhead stamped in the corner. They had done homework, folding family into a business move like it was neat. Why, I asked. Why now, Dad said. It's time. Mom kept looking at her hands like she was trying to iron the lines of the whole thing smooth with her palms. We thought we'd tell you together, she said, which meant they'd talked about it without me. I thought of the time I patched the roof after that storm, up on the ladder with rain spitting salt sweating through my shirt. I thought of the spreadsheet I keep on my laptop with dates and costs and a column called labor where I put my own hours with nothing in dollars. I said, I paid for things, I fixed it, I live here. The words felt small in the kitchen air. Emma reached out as if to touch my arm and I pulled back because their version of closeness had a bill attached that I hadn't signed for. Jason, Dad said, and his voice moved like it used to when he'd tell me to toe the line. It's business now. We're protecting the asset for the family. Protecting. The word tasted like a discount sign. I wanted to list everything. The Newell post I sanded, the attic fan I chased replacement parts for, the nights I lay awake with the breaker box memorized. I wanted to show them the stack of receipts, the spreadsheet cell that read 17420. Instead I asked, did you tell Mom about the roof estimate last spring? He blinked at me like I had changed languages. They had a plan. Emma and Ryan had spreadsheets of their own, renovation timelines, projected rent for an upstairs studio, a branded lifestyle series idea where before and after shots and cafe steam would make this house a set. Ryan had charm and polished shoes the neighborhood hadn't seen before, and he leaned back at the table like someone on a movie set waiting for applause. We have investors, he said. This is bigger than any of us. Bigger. The house had a bigger future, but smaller for me. Mom's eyes brimmed and she said, we didn't want to surprise you. But she had signed forms, answered calls, penned checks to a paralegal. Surprising someone usually involves not signing their future away. I asked, did you ask me to be part of this decision? And the room answered with the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle tick of a clock that had been patient for decades. We gave you time, Dad said, which read like they had given me pretend time while they did the paperwork. I got up and walked the shell of the house like a person tracing old scars. The stairs I had replaced after the mice problem felt solid under my palm. The hallway I painted in the fall with a color Emma insisted would photograph still smelled faintly of fresh latex. I ran my fingers along the banister I had sanded and thought about claiming it with my body, not my invoices. Instead, I came back to the table and sat like a man who knows the shutoff valve and the right lever to pull in a panic, but who also knows that sometimes the valve is behind someone else's lock. Okay, I said again, but this time I put conditions on it. You can't do this on 3 days' notice. If you're going to change tenancy, do it by the book. Give me written notice that follows the ordinance. Provide moving assistance if you want me out sooner. And if the deed is in an LLC, show me the transfer paperwork. They exchanged looks like they were rewinding a tape to find where they'd left the honest bit. Emma said, you always want everything in writing. I replied, that's what keeps things clean. Dad's face hardened. This isn't a negotiation, Jason. I knew the tone. It was the same tone from the hardware aisle when he told me we don't complain, we hold the line. Then sign it, I said. If you want me gone under conditions, put it in writing and I'll respond. If you want to fight, start the legal process so we can both be adults about it. The offer felt formal, but it was how I survived in IT support, document, email, receive receipts. It was a rhythm I trusted even here at the kitchen table. Mom's shoulders shook and she pressed a napkin to her mouth. I don't want this, she said. No one wanted the house divided, but houses get divided all the time with pies cut into tidy slices. I realized then that this wasn't about what anyone wanted. It was about the person who could change a document and the person who couldn't. I boxed up my wrench then, not as surrender, but as a pause. Email me everything, I said. If you want me gone, do it legally. If you want to keep me as a tenant, we renegotiate honestly. Emma's tight smile broke for a second into something like confusion, as if her rehearsed line had been edited mid-scene. They pushed the envelope back like a hot potato, and the kitchen absorbed the muffled sounds of family recalibrating. I left with a list in my head: inspect the lease, call a tenant rights group, make a moving estimate. The wrench fit in my hand like a truth I could carry. As I closed the door behind me, the house felt quieter, like a machine missing a cog and not yet sure it needed to make a sound. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew what I would do: document, respond, and stop fixing other people's emergencies without being paid or asked. The eviction felt like the last act of a long play that I'd been improvising in for years, and I was only just noticing the script. After college, I moved into the bottom flat for family rent, $650 a month, while the neighbors paid close to $1,300. I told myself it was a favor and a trade: cheaper rent for labor. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I learned drywall from videos at night, watched tutorials on wiring basics, and mapped the breakers until the panel felt like a familiar road map. I logged every repair in a spreadsheet like it was a habit prayer: date, cost, hours. The ledger read like devotion. I patched the kitchen ceiling after that summer storm when rain had found the seam above the sink. I replaced the rotten cabinet bottoms with plywood I stained myself and bought hinges that didn't squeak. I paid deposits when roof crews demanded money up front. I wired outlets that tripped because someone had a power tool in the wrong circuit. I texted vendors, argued with insurance reps on hold, and told the roof guy where the ladder landed. If you broke something, I fixed it. If a neighbor complained about mice, I sealed the hole. It felt like being the house's heartbeat. Emma drifted in and out with a duffel and a new plan. She'd come with a smile and a suitcase and a promise about the next ticket she was going to punch to a better life. "Just crash here while I get it together," she said, and I said, "Of course." Weeks turned into months more than once. She worked bartending gigs, short bursts of freelance writing, a pop-up boutique that lasted just long enough to spend all her cash on samples. I lent money when the car light blinked and when rent fell short between projects. I lent a lot more than I told myself I would. "Pay me back next Friday," she'd say, and another Friday would arrive with a new excuse. After the wedding, she'd promise once. After my tax return, she'd promise another time. The ledger grew, but the parts labeled repaid stayed thin. I kept the receipts and the logs because in my head that made the favors practical. If I could show the numbers, then maybe it was business, not bleeding. Dad talked about legacy like a forecast you can't change. "This place keeps us together," he'd always say, like it was a reason and not a pressure. Mom would ask for help quietly at the kitchen table like a person passing a note. "Can you transfer $180 for the gas bill?" she whispered once, and I did it without fanfare. Every small emergency had a path that ran through me. People started treating me like infrastructure, always there, rarely noticed until something snapped. There were nights I stayed up with tools spread across my kitchen table, thinking the work would eventually become my return. I patched a hole, painted the trim, and thought, if I keep this up, it will stabilize. I logged hours like a record of honor and told myself I was being practical. Practicality became a shield against asking for more. Instead of saying my own needs out loud, I made lists and spreadsheets and small transfers and pretended that would be enough. The house took from me in ways that weren't just money. I missed chances to move out, to say yes to a job interview across town, to stop being the default fixer and start being someone else's client. I missed rent hikes and opportunities because my life fit into the cracks of this place. When friends moved into apartments that felt like progress, I smiled and told them congrats. I told myself I liked the savings. It was easy to call it sacrifice when the ledger looked tidy. I kept stacked receipts in a folder named House and a column labeled Labor where I typed hours as if I could put my time into a vault. I began to feel like the maintenance record for a house that was secretly a family calendar. Birthdays, funerals, weddings, everything folded under the roof I kept in order. When Dad complained about paperwork or when Mom fretted about forms, I was the hands that turned the pages. It became normal for them to ask, and it became normal for me to say yes. Sometimes I tried to set limits. I would say, "I can cover this month, not next," and they'd nod and take it like a donation. Sometimes I would say no and be met with surprise like I'd spoken another language. I wanted to be steady. Steady was a label I had worn since I was 10, and Dad told me men like us don't complain. Steady turned into enabling without me noticing. My spreadsheet kept getting longer while my voice got quieter. When the eviction papers slid across the table, they didn't just take the place I'd been sleeping in. They took all the unpriced hours, the small kindnesses, the nights I climbed roofs in rain. I could show them the ledger and claim some kind of recompense, but numbers don't always change feelings. Still, I learned in that kitchen that ledger or no ledger, I had been giving a lot for a little. The eviction made all that invisible work visible in the most brutal way. They made a business decision, and I found out too late I was the unpaid labor. I packed one wrench into a box and started listing the rest of the receipts like a map of the life I'd held together. I watched the slow pivot like it was a trick in plain sight, a magician's hand that only I seemed to notice. After Dad's friend died, he started sorting papers at the kitchen table, and one day a folder labeled estate appeared on his desk like a quiet animal. He didn't announce it, just moved the papers into it the way someone moves furniture when they mean to stay. I asked about it once and he said, just organizing. But organizing turns into deciding if you leave things in place, or pick them up and move them where you think they'll do more good. Then Emma announced she was engaged to Ryan, a man who wore expensive shoes and talked about building a brand like it was a blueprint. He came over and smelled like a new suit and coffee from a place that charges for ambience. Ryan liked to sit back and describe plans with charts and phrases that made everything sound scalable and Instagrammable. Dad seemed to like him right away, and Mom said he was a go-getter, as if that covered any question you might have about his motives. They fit into the house like a new piece of furniture. Not long after, insurance went up by $1,500 a year as if the house had aged overnight. Dad sent a group text to the family, "Need contributions to keep the home in the family." The words were small and efficient like a receipt. I was the one who replied with actual numbers and transfers. I moved money like a person who knows what a late fee feels like, sliding funds to cover a jump that would otherwise look like a crack in the roof. Emma sent a heart emoji and an "I'll chip in soon" that stretched into the next month. Then the conversation about upstairs started like it always does, a bright idea pushed quickly into a plan. Emma talked about making the upstairs a studio, about monetizing the property and filming before and afters that would show how a family home becomes a lifestyle backdrop. She suggested I move into the storage room temporarily while they set things up. "Be flexible, Jason," she said with that practiced optimism that expects the world to rearrange around her. I told her it's my home too, and the room's air swallowed that line like it was a small stone dropped into a deep well. They didn't ask much at first, just small favors that added up. "Can you get a quote from the roof guy?" Dad would say. "Can you hold on to these receipts?" Mom asked one night, and I did because that's the way our house had worked for years. They had a plan and I had labor. I was always the connective tissue between an idea and a finished wall. But that role is easy to take for granted. It becomes an unspoken expectation that someone else will always turn the screws. I remember the day I found the deed in a folder on the table. It was quiet, like it had been waiting for me to notice and then planned to make me look foolish when I did. The deed had been transferred into an LLC with a name that sounded like a brand or a promise. My name wasn't on it anymore. They'd arranged it in a way that made the change feel like a clerical move rather than the closing of a door. When I asked Dad about it, he said, "We had to do it for taxes, for the family." The phrase "for the family" kept surfacing like a justification with a polite edge. I asked Emma why she hadn't talked to me directly about the plan. She sighed and said, "We thought you'd understand. This helps everyone." I said, "It helps you and Ryan." The silence after that answer was the kind you get when someone realizes they've been edited out of the script. She told me to be patient. I told her patience was not the same as erasure. She frowned like I'd used a word she didn't expect in an argument. When Dad slid the eviction papers across the table later, it felt like the final click of a mechanism that had been winding for months. Everything they'd been doing, the folder, the calls, the heart emoji, made sense in a way that hurt. It wasn't just that they'd chosen a different path. It was that they decided my labor wasn't part of the plan anymore. If you build things for a house, the cabinets, the wiring, the time, you start to count on being counted. I realized how many things I'd let go unsaid, how many receipts I kept like a private ledger of favors. I thought about all the nights I climbed on the roof with a tarp and a flashlight, about the winter when the pipes froze and I went next door at dawn to thaw them out before anyone noticed. I thought about telling them I didn't sign up to be unpaid maintenance, but that would have sounded like a complaint, like I'd violated some inherited rule about who gets to ask for help. Instead, I started writing emails, saving PDFs, and planning the next steps with a clarity I hadn't used for myself before. The folder on Dad's desk had been the sign that the play had an act change. I collected my receipts like proof and prepared to make my case. They set a day for a family meeting with lemon squares and too much polish, like they were launching something and needed a crowd. Emma cleared her throat and laid out the plan: keep me month to month while they renovated the upstairs, then charge market and monetize the space. She said it like it was practical, like it was inevitable, like it was already in motion. Ryan sat back and smiled as if he'd already picked color schemes for the lifestyle shots. The words landed like a weight on the table. I didn't let it sit. I pulled my folder out of my bag and spread it on the coffee table like a map. I have a signed lease through January, I said, and I put the lease down for everyone to see. I added the invoices next, $17,420 in materials listed across different sheets, each one with dates and vendor names. I put the bank transfer records down too, the ones showing the extra money I'd sent for insurance and taxes. I watched faces change as the paper stack grew. Emma's tight smile thinned a bit. Mom pressed her fingers together. Dad looked like someone who had been taught to solve things with a wrench but not with paperwork. You can't just take my home, I said, and the sentence sounded like a stone in my hand. I'm a tenant, I pay rent, I have rights. I kept my voice steady because I'd learned that steady is sometimes louder than anger. 60 days notice is required in this city for no-cause evictions, I said, because I had checked the ordinance at night and printed the relevant lines in black and white. You transfer the deed to an LLC, but that doesn't remove my tenant protections. I watched them realize their paperwork didn't erase the city's laws. Dad snapped at me like someone who'd been surprised by the resistance in his own house. You're making this ugly, he said, like ugliness was under my control and could be switched off. No, I answered, I'm making it true. I slid the stack of repair invoices across the table until the laminated one caught the light. This is the work I've done, this is the money I've put in, this is the life I've built here. You can call that ugly or you can call it accounted for. Emma tried to frame it back into a softer plan. We want to keep it in the family, she said. We aren't trying to hurt you. The logic was familiar. Listen to the plan and believe the motive. I said, keeping it in the family doesn't mean you get to erase who kept it running. If you want to monetize upstairs, fine. Give me the legal notice, arrange for moving assistance or fair compensation, and let's do it lawfully. My folder felt like a shield and a ledger both. It was everything they'd relied on me to be, and everything they'd hoped I would keep quiet about. Ryan leaned forward and argued that investors wanted certainty and that a month-to-month tenant mudded the timeline. We can offer relocation assistance, he said. We can transition smoothly. I named a number for moving costs and for the time I'd lose finding a new place and setting up. He blinked like the figure surprised him. That's unreasonable, he said. I replied, then put it in writing. Start the process if you want a faster move. Don't expect me to leave on someone else's schedule without compensation. Mom began to cry softly and said she didn't want to see us fight. I walked over and took her hand because the person sitting in front of me wasn't my opponent. She squeezed my fingers and whispered, we just want what's best for the family. I said, I know that. I also said, family shouldn't mean you can take someone's home without following the rules. There was a hard, true edge to that sentence, and it felt like setting a boundary for the first time in years. When talk of lawyers and LLCs began to swirl, I got practical. Let's put everything in writing, I said. Any change needs to be documented. If you want me out, serve the notice. If you want me to stay, we renegotiate the lease with fair rent and clear responsibilities. No more verbal fixes. They exchanged looks like people suddenly aware the old system of favors and quiet work had a new referee, the law and my own spine. The meeting ended with tentative promises and a stack of coffee cups. Emma hugged me and said, we'll try to make this easy. Her voice trembled just a little. I hugged back, feeling the ledger in my back pocket like a second heart. I left the room with a plan in my head: contact tenant rights, schedule an inspection of the records, and make a moving estimate just in case. Inside me, something that had been patient for years shifted into someone who would answer with documents, not apologies. The house would now have to deal with me as more than a handyman. It would have to deal with me as a person who could put a value on his own help and refuse to give it away for free. They kept saying, be reasonable, like it was a kindness they were granting, and I kept answering in a way they couldn't afford to ignore: in writing. Everything in writing, I said aloud at the table so the phrase landed like a small promise. Dad looked away. Emma tapped her phone like she could scroll me out of the conversation. Fine, she said finally and offered a deal. Raise your rent to $1,700 starting July 1 and extend your move out to July 31. It was a number that pretended to help while still looking like leverage. I heard the math. 2 weeks of raised rent would pad their renovations and give them time to list upstairs at market. It sounded civil, and it sounded like I would be paying for the privilege of leaving. I forwarded my signed lease to Mom and Emma with a short, firm note. As discussed, I'll vacate by July 31. Rent remains per lease $650. Communications in writing. Hitting send felt like snapping a hinge into place. The email was a small thing that changed the rhythm of how we handled everything. No more late-night requests, no more casual "can you just" texts. If they wanted maintenance, ask in email. If they needed money, invoice me. If they wanted me gone sooner, send proper notice. I had spent years fixing things on a handshake. I'd been paid in gratitude and empty promises. Now I wanted receipts and a timestamp. The clock was suddenly mine in a way it hadn't been. I started to build a moving budget that sat on my kitchen counter like a plan with teeth. Truck rental, $160 for a day. Deposit for a new place, $1,300. First month's rent, $1,300. Those numbers added up faster than my heart liked. I wrote them down and set aside what I could. I sold the old coffee table on a neighborhood app to make a dent and texted Ben to ask if he still lifted furniture for cheap. He said yes and wrote back, "Got your back, man." The small kindness felt like a lifeline. I set a strict rule for communications, email only for maintenance and money. I told Mom, Dad, and Emma that everything else could happen in person or by phone, but if it involved the house or the bills, it had to be in writing. It sounded formal, but I needed that formality. It kept the favors from sliding back into obligations and the conversations from wandering into the soft places where guilt grows. They didn't like it at first, but they nodded. It was easier to nod than to change the habit of asking me to solve problems on the fly for free. There were small, practical steps to take too. I called the tenant rights hotline I'd bookmarked and scheduled a consultation. I printed the ordinance about 60-day notice and stapled it to the lease copy. I photographed the condition of my unit, dated the photos, and saved them in a folder labeled Move-Out Evidence on my cloud drive. I made a checklist for tasks I couldn't afford to skip. Change my address, cancel utilities, forward mail, set up automatic transfers to a savings account I called Future Jason. The act of making lists steadied me in a way that words hadn't. Emma texted once that night, "We can help with moving, we'll give you a few boxes." I replied, "Email the offer with dates and how many boxes, I'll book the truck if we agree." She sent a thumbs up. There was a small battle over the garage opener, they asked for it. I took a photo of it on the counter and emailed them the image with the subject line "Garage Opener Inventory." It felt petty in a way that also felt necessary. I was cataloging what belonged to whom, and making sure the record matched the reality. There were moments when my chest tightened and the old habit of smoothing things back over tried to take hold. When Mom called to ask if I could watch Emma's cat for a week, my first impulse was to say yes. Instead, I paused and said, "Email me the dates." Silence followed like a test. She complied. The email was small and unthreatening, but it marked a new boundary. The line between family favors and work had to be drawn somewhere, and I was tired of being the default. People started to treat me differently when I stopped being immediately available. Ryan tried to charm me at the house, offering to make this easy. I liked his suit less every time he called it a brand and not a person. Dad stopped trying to fix things with comments and started asking questions about logistics. Maybe the shock of being asked for written notice stirred something in him. Maybe he finally saw that a lease wasn't a suggestion, or maybe he just had to learn the rules he helped teach me. As July crept closer, I packed methodically. I boxed the things I'd always meant to keep. The wrench with the worn grip, the photo from college, the hand-me-down sweater that smelled faintly of Dad when he wasn't around. I sold appliances I couldn't store and listed the heavy stuff for pickup. The counting down of boxes became a kind of arithmetic for letting go. I gave myself permission to be practical the way I'd always been for other people. On the last Sunday before my move, Mom made lasagna and we ate at the kitchen table with old plates. Conversation was careful and soft. Emma hovered and then left to take a call. Dad sat across from me and said, "We didn't mean to hurt you." I replied, "I know." I didn't say everything, some of it still needed paper and evidence and time. I said, "Email me any offers. If you want me to leave earlier, put it in writing with compensation." He nodded slowly, the way someone learns to read a manual for the first time. The clock didn't feel like theirs anymore. I had the room of my life measured out in emails and receipts and moving reservations. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical, which was what I'd always been. The wrench went into a toolbox, the last box taped closed, and the key slid across the table with an email copy of the lease attached. The clock belonged to me now, and I had plans for what to do with the time. The building's neglect bit back in a way that felt almost surgical, like the house was finally naming a debt it had been owed. The city inspector came through for the standard rental check and walked the upstairs with a clipboard, tapping his pen. He left a yellow notice on the door, bathroom fan vented into the attic, loose handrail. It was the kind of paper that smells like pressure. I read the photo Emma sent and my chest tightened because I'd warned about that vent months ago and no one had fixed it. Minutes after the inspector left, the house answered with a loud pop and then water. A corroded galvanized line in the upstairs hall exploded and white water poured through the ceiling I had painted the summer before. The ceiling broke in slow chunks like a white rain that smelled like drywall and old dust. I heard Emma scream on the phone when she called. "Where's the main shutoff?" she cried. I stayed calm because I knew the lock and the lever and where panic could make things worse. "Hit it twice," I told her. "Don't trust the first click." She did. They managed to stop the flow. I could hear Ryan cursing in the background and Dad asking if anyone had a tarp. I went over immediately, boots on, heart high and practical. The hall looked like someone had emptied a milk carton on the floor and then tried to mop it up with their hands. There was water in the ceiling cavity, plaster dust in the hallway, and the sharp smell of wet paper. I helped ferry soaked boxes down the stairs because family photos deserve rescue regardless of deeds. We moved albums like relics, towels under the boxes, church candles, and wedding photos stacked like a small museum that needed saving. When I handed a box to Mom, she held it to her chest and said, "Thank you," with a voice that sounded like it had been running on coffee and worry for days. I walked the ruined hallway and saw the old galv line split like a seam I'd been told to ignore. The plumber's school of thought is simple: if something's corroded, replace it. If it's patched, expect another leak. I took pictures, dated them, and filed them in the same cloud folder where I kept receipts and the lease. Documentation is boring until you need it, then it becomes the sharpest thing you own. Emma emailed a photo with a caption, "Can you oversee repairs? We'll pay $250. The number landed like someone trying to buy help in fast cash. I replied with a few contacts: the plumber who'd fixed the heater last winter, the electrician who does honest work, the drywall guy who knows old houses, and I wrote my rate, $50 an hour invoiced weekly. I didn't make it a negotiation text, I made it a business outline. I can coordinate vendors, be on-site, and document the repairs, I wrote. If you want me to do labor, my rate applies. If you want me to supervise and handle calls only, I can cap hours. It felt strange to write my own price for the first time at a kitchen table, where I'd given so much for free. They called it insane at first, like the small number I'd asked for was an affront. Emma tried to bargain the rate down and Ryan said it was too pricey, as if the work of someone who knows the house could be discounted because we'd once shared sugar at breakfast. I answered calmly, "If you want me to risk my time and tools, pay the rate. If you want the cheaper option, hire someone else." Plumbers and electricians don't come cheap, and coordinating them takes time you can't bill in sympathy. The plumber I recommended arrived the next day, shook his head at the corroded line, and told Emma, "This has been building for years." He replaced the line, cut out rotten sections, and installed new copper piping. He handed Emma an invoice that made her face go pale. The work cost more than the $250 she'd offered me to oversee it. She called me after he left and said, "We didn't know it would be that bad." I said, "You should have listened to the inspector and to the warnings." The yellow notice is a deadline, not a suggestion. There was a quiet pause on the phone, like a small learning happening slowly. I kept documenting everything. I saved the plumber's invoice in my folder, logged the hours I'd spent coordinating, and wrote a brief summary email to Emma with the subject line "Repairs Hall Leak Invoice" and attached photos. The email was simple and direct. Repairs completed. Plumber invoice attached. My coordination time 6 hours at $50 hour. Please remit payment by next Friday. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical and very, very fair. They paid the plumber, they paid me. The garage opener question came up again: who had been given responsibility for keys and code. I photographed the opener on the counter and labeled it in an email like inventory. It felt oddly necessary after the leak, which had shown that unchecked things compound. Parents forget to update things and houses collect obligations. I was no longer the silent person who took care of everything and didn't ask for receipts. I was a man who kept records and invoices and small boundaries. Carrying boxes of photos down from the damp attic, handing them to people who had once tried to evict me, felt like a quiet form of mercy. I could see the strain in Emma's face when the bills came in. I could see Ryan's jaw tighten when estimates arrived. They'd learned the hard way that a house fed on unpaid labor will eventually call the bill due, and the bill was more than money. It was trust and hours and quiet nights on a roof. In the weeks after the leak, the house smelled like sawdust and cleaner, and the conversations shifted from "we need flexibility" to "we'll document everything." I kept my rate the same and my email folder organized, and slowly, the clock ticked in a way that felt like mine again. Emma called the plumber and he handed her a bill that made the room go quiet, $1,250. He shook his head and said, "This place isn't turnkey," like it was a warning and not a judgment. The upstairs looked like the aftermath of a storm: drywall dust, sagging insulation, and a smell that stuck in the throat. Emma sat on the stairs and cried into a towel, the towel pressed to her face like she was holding herself together with fabric. I watched her from the doorway, feeling the old reflex to fix things kick in, but I also felt a new pause where I used to leap. Dad stood by the hall with his hands in his pockets, looking at me like I was a problem his wrench couldn't solve. He kept opening and closing his mouth as if the right line could mend what the paperwork had started. "We didn't expect it to be this bad," he said finally, and the sentence had the thinness of someone discovering consequences later than everyone else. I held a box in my hands and thought about every time I'd climbed a ladder in the rain to patch a leak so they didn't have to worry at night. All those small fixes had piled into a quiet account that no one had been balancing. I packed like I was cataloging a life. 6 boxes on Monday, labeled in my neat block letters: kitchen plates, tools, small books, manuals. 3 trash bags on Wednesday, the kind that swallow old shirts and coffee mugs and receipts that only mean something to me. Labeling the boxes felt like trying to reclaim pieces of myself from a house that had been rearranged by other people. I folded clothes carefully and set the wrench on top of a box labeled Tools, Jason. The motion was ordinary, and it steadied me more than I expected. In the top of a box, I found a list of small loans I had kept track of for myself, a neat column of numbers and dates with names next to them. Emma's name was on it more than once. I stared at it for a long time and then deleted the file. It felt like burning a ledger I no longer wanted to carry. Letting it go wasn't an erase of memory. It was a decision to stop keeping score in a book that only I read. The deletion made a soft hollow in my chest and also made room for something else. The thought that my patience had limits and that keeping tab didn't mean I had to collect. When Mom left a voicemail that night, her voice broke and sounded small on my phone. "Please don't walk away from us," she begged, like the whole family could be held by one person staying put. My thumb hovered over the call button and I felt the old pull to rush back and fix the hurt. Instead, I texted a short promise: Sunday dinner, no money talk. It felt like a shoreline I could hold, presence without negotiation. I didn't want to erase the hope of a family meal, but I also needed to stop making my body the default solution to their emergencies. People said things when I packed. Ryan asked if I wanted help and then hovered like someone trying to look useful without understanding how to be. Emma wiped her eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Jace." The first time her voice sounded less like a script and more like a person trying to find a truth. She handed me a small box of my things and then turned away quickly. I felt the sting of that apology and tucked it away with the spatulas. It was something, and it was not enough. The house grew quieter with every box I taped shut. Neighbors came by to say they were sorry about the leak and that they hadn't known the place needed so much. A few offered to help move. Ben actually showed up with his truck and said, "Let's get this done," like a friend who remembers how heavy couches can be. We lifted the couch down the stairs and loaded the truck in the dusk. The work of moving felt honest in a way the meetings had not, muscle and breath and shared jokes about the awkward shape of my old lamp. It reminded me that some things you do for community and some things you do because you have to, and the two can overlap. I made a final walk through my unit before the last box went in the truck. I checked the outlets, turned off the breaker I always knew, and wiped down the counter where Emma had once left a mug. The wrench went into the toolbox with a finality like closing a chapter. I left a copy of the lease on the counter with a short note: "As discussed, vacated July 31, rent per lease." I slid the key across the table and set it by the envelope I'd received weeks before. The house smelled like cleaner and the echo of footsteps that had become mine. On the drive to the new place, I felt a mixed quiet, grief for what had been taken and relief for what I was finally keeping. Sunday dinner would happen. Mom's voice would be there in the next week with lasagna and small talk. I would be present, but with a line drawn in emails and copies filed in a cloud I alone could access. I had promised myself to be practical, and for the first time that practicality wasn't only for other people's comfort. It was for mine. I man-wheeled the last box down the front steps on July 30 like it was a small victory and a small surrender at the same time, and Emma, my sister, stood on the porch with a clipboard, hair pulled back, eyes tired in a way that looked like the end of a long shift. "You're really leaving?" she asked, the question hanging like she had rehearsed it and still wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Yes," I said, and the word felt honest in my mouth. I didn't make a speech. I didn't look for drama. I just slid the box into the truck and closed the door. The new place was above a barber shop, a narrow studio with windows that faced a brick wall and picked up the city's afternoon heat. I put my boxes down and made the kettle click, and when it purred, I felt the small comfort of a routine starting. I bought a cheap plant and named it Jason because it made me laugh a little and because naming things helps them stay alive. The space was tight, but it was mine to set up and not to patch for someone else's plans. I put the wrench in a drawer and left it there for when I needed it, not for when someone else thought a problem needed fixing. I found simple rhythms quickly. I started each morning at the bakery 2 blocks over where the barista calls my name and pours my coffee without asking. I walk to the clinic where I do its support and help people who are quietly doing hard things, and then I walk home the long way when the city calls me out through alleys and small parks. The walk became a place to think without the weight of family expectations pressed into my shoulders. I read on the way sometimes, or count the bricks like a small meditation. The pace changed and felt like a breath I hadn't known I needed. Calls from family that had once arrived in dozens a day thinned like a winter crowd. There were fewer group messages with urgent in the subject. The number of calls dropped from a flood to a few a week. A casserole picture from Mom, a check-in from Dad, an occasional emoji from Emma that meant she was okay. My phone felt lighter. I started to answer selectively, and when someone asked for work on the house or to just come by real quick, I began to text back, "Email me." The phrase became a filter that transformed favors into something measurable. It kept the old habit from sneaking back in as obligation. I set an automatic transfer to a savings account and labeled it Future Jason. It was $60 a week at first, nothing dramatic, but it was a habit and it was mine. Seeing it pop into the account gave me a small steady feeling like sunlight through blinds. I also made a moving budget that had actually worked. Truck paid, deposit paid, first month covered. The math didn't thrill me, but the result did. I had a plan that didn't depend on anyone else's heartstrings. People expected apologies. They expected tears. They wanted me to call and say I forgave everyone and that nothing had happened. I didn't get the big apology. Nobody called to say they were wrong. I might have hoped for one, a sentence that would have sewn up an old wound, but I didn't need it the way I thought. What I needed more was clarity and a place that noticed my time as valuable. I got that instead, a life that answered me back. I still go to the house sometimes for small things, drop a tool off, pick up a mail package my mother couldn't fit. Those visits are brief. I walk in and out like a person who knows where the shutoff is and who keeps the receipts in a clear folder, not because I want to be petty but because I learned how to protect myself. I keep my exchanges in email and print the important ones. It feels formal, but the form keeps the emotional costs from creeping back into my ordinary days. Emma and I talk now with a different cadence. There are fewer assumptions and more questions. She asks how the plant is doing and I tell her a story about the kettle. She sends a photo of the upstairs staged and bright and I reply, nice work. There is no gloating, no collapse. It's small courtesies exchanged like people learning new rules. We are both adjusting. Sometimes she still texts late, asking a question about a vendor, and I send a contact and an invoice for my time. It feels strange to bill the family, but bills make boundaries clear in ways words do not. On Sundays, I go to my mother's house for dinner sometimes. I sit at her table and eat lasagna and talk about small things until the evening settles down. We don't talk about money when we eat. We talk about recipes and the weather and the neighbor's dog. I show up because I want to, not because my presence is the currency that pays for quiet. Those dinners feel like a reclaimed corner of family life, honest and separate from the work I do to keep my life steady. If you ask me what I lost in all of this, I'll say the idea that being steady means being invisible. If you ask me what I gained, I will say my own time and a louder voice. I can say email me and mean it. I can set aside money for me. I can answer the door for a neighbor without carrying the house on my shoulders anymore. I didn't get a neat ending with apologies and confessions. I got something else. Clarity, space, and a life that, for the first time in a long time, feels like it belongs to me. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.